Good morning. Today we're having our first class of community health, and we're talking about the principles of communicable disease and, and epidemiology. The objectives of this class are: first, we're going to define epidemiology. Then, we're going to talk about the epidemiological triad. Then, we're going to define the communicable disease. After that, we're talking about the importance of studying communicable disease epidemiology. Then, we're going to clarify some terminology. And finally, we're talking about the dynamics of disease transmission, the change of infection, like human reservoir or source, and modes of transmission. First, what is epidemiology? Is the study of the distribution and determinants of health-related states and events in a population, and the application of this study to control health problems. The epidemiological triad: we have a host that could be a person, an animal, food. Then we have an agent that is going to be a bacteria, virus, parasite, and then we need an environment. In the host, we need to have some we need to identify the demographic characteristics, the biological characteristics, and the socioeconomic characteristics. In the agents, we have biological agents, physical agents, chemical, nutrient agents, mechanical agents, and social agents. And in the environment, we have physical environment, biological, and social environment. In the infection disease model, we need to have the host, the pathogens, and the environment. All that have to come together to produce a disease. What is the definition of communicable disease? Is an illness due to a specific infection, biological agent, or its toxic product capable of being directly or indirectly transmitted from man to man, from animal to man, from animal to animal, and from the environment. Could be through earth, water, food to a man. Why is important to study communicable diseases? First, we need to know the changes of the pattern of infection disease, then discover new infections, and also know the possibility that some chronic disease have an infective origin. Some terminology and important definitions. First, we're going to know what is infection, contamination, infestation, contagious disease, incidence and prevalence of infection disease, ep- epidemic, endemic, hyperendemic, holoendemic, and pandemic. What is exotic, sporadic, attack rate, primary or secondary cases, zoonosis, epizootic, and enzoonotic. Nosocomial infection, opportunistic infection, eradication, and elimination. Also, we need to know what is virulence, reproductive rate of infection, host, vector, and reservoir. Incubation period, ineffective period, serial interval, latent period, and that's it. First, what is an infection? An infection is the entry and development or multiplication of an infectious agent in the body of man or animals. An infection does not always cause illness. There are several levels of infection. First, we have the colonization, where, for example, the Staphylococcus aureus in the skin is we can find it in the skin and in nasopharynx. Then we have a subclinical or inapparent infection like polio. Then we have a latent infection like a virus of herpes. Then we manifest a clinical infection. Contamination is the presence of an infectious agent on a body surface or in clothes, bedding, toys, surgical instruments, or dressing, or other articles or substances, including water or food. Infestation is the lodgement, development, and reproduction of arthropods on the surface of the body or in the clothing. Lice, like for example, lice, itch, mites. These terms could be also used to describe the invasion of the gut by parasitic worm. Contagious disease. Our contagious disease is the one that is transmitted through contact. For example, scabies, trachoma, and leprosy. What is host? Is a person or an animal that affords substances or lodgement to an animal to an infectious agent under natural conditions. These include an obligate host, a definite host, an intermediate host, and a transport host. Vector or infection is an insect or any living carrier that transports an infectious agent from an infectious individual or its waste to a susceptible individual or its food or immediate surroundings, both biological and mechanical transmission. What is reservoir? Any person, animal, arthropod, plant, soil, or substance, or a combination of these, in which an infection agent normally lives and multiplies, on which it depends primarily for survival, and where it reproduces itself in such a manner that it can be transmitted to a susceptible host. It is the natural habit of the infectious disease. Now we're talking about various incidence and prevalence of infection diseases. First, incidence is the number of new cases in a given time of period expressed as percent infected per year, or the number of time person per person time for observation. Prevalence is the number of cases at a given time expressed as a percent as a given time. Prevalence is a product of incidence for duration of disease, and it is of little interest in an infection disease is of short duration, but may be interest in infection disease. It is a full of long duration. Endemic. Endemic means the usual occurrence in a community of disease, specific health related behavior, or other healthly related events, clearly in excess of expected occurrence. Epi means upon and demos people. Endemic can occur upon endemic states too. Endemic, it refers to the constant presence of a disease or infection agent within given geographic area or population group. It is the usual or expected frequency of the disease within a population. End means in and demos people. Hyperendemic, an all-endemic term. Hyperendemic expresses that the disease is constantly present at high incidence or prevalence rates that affects all age groups equally. The term holoendemic expresses a high level of infection beginning early in life and affecting most of the child population, leading to a state of equilibrium such that the adult population shows evidence of the disease much less commonly than do the children. Pandemic and exotic. Pandemic is an epidemic usually affecting a large proportion of the population occurring over a wide geographic area such as a section of a nation, the entire nation, a continent, or the world, like influenza pandemics. Exotic diseases are those which are imported into a country in which do not otherwise occur. For example, rabies in the UK. Sporadic is the word that means scattered about. The cases occur irregularly, haphazardly, from the time to time, and generally infrequently. The cases are prior and separate widely in time and place that they are shown not or little connection with each other, not a recognizable common source of infection like polio, meningococcal meningitis, and tetanus. However, a sporadic disease could be a starting point of an epidemic when the conditions are favorable for its spread. Attack rates and primary and secondary cases. Attack rate is the proportion of non-immune exposed individuals who become clinical ill. Primary and secondary cases, the person the person who comes into and infects a population and is the primary case. Those who subsequently contract the infection are secondary cases. Further spread is described as wave or generations. Zoonosis, epizoonotic, and enzootic. Zoonosis is an infection that is transmittable under natural conditions from vertebrate animals to men. For example, rabies, plague, and bovine tuberculosis. An epizootic is an outbreak, an epidemic of diseases in an animal population. An enzootic is found in animals. For example, bovine tuberculosis. In the other hand, nosocomial infections are infections hospital acquired. Is an infection originating in a patient while in a hospital or another healthcare facility. It has to be a new disorder and relate to the patient's primary conditions. For example, examples include infection of surgical wounds, hepatitis B, and urinary tract infections. In the other hand, opportunities infection. This is an infection by organisms that take the opportunity to provide by the defected host defense to infect the host and those cases and cause the disease. For example, opportunity infections are very common in AIDS. Organisms include herpes simplex and cytomegalovirus. Eradication and elimination is the termination of all transmission of infection by the extermination of the infectious agent through surveillance and containment. Eradication is an absolute process, an all or none phenomenon restricted to the termination of the infection from the whole world. The term elimination is sometimes used to describe eradication of a disease from a large geographic region. Diseases which are amenable to elimination in meantime are polio, measles, and diphtheria. The reproductive rate of infection is potential for an infection disease to spread. Influential factors include the probability of transmission between an infected and a susceptible individual, frequency of population contact, duration of infection, virulence of the organism, and population immune proportion. Now we're going to talk about the dynamics of disease transmission, the change of infection. First, we need a source or a reservoir. We need to know the modes of transmission, and then we need a susceptible host. First, the source of the reservoir is the starting point for occurrence of the communicable disease in the existence of source of infection. The source of infection is defined as the person, animal, object, or substance from which an infection agent passes or is disseminated to the host. And the reservoir is any person, animal, arthropod, plant, soil substance in which the infectious agent normally lives and multiplies, on which it depends primarily for survival. We have some types of reservoir. First, human reservoir, animal, and non-living. The human reservoir, we have the cases. We have the primary or secondary cases. According to the spectrum of the disease, we have clinical cases, mild, severe, typical or atypical, subclinical cases, and latent infection. We have some types, incubatory, convalescent, and healthy. And that has a duration, temporary or chronic. And a portal of exit, urinary, intestinal, respiratory, and others. A case is defined as a person in the population of study group identifies as having the particular disease, health disorder, or condition under investigation. The carriers, it occurs either due to inadequate treatment or immune response. The disease agent is not completely eliminated, leading to the carrier state. It is an infected person or animal that harbors a specific infection agent in the absence of discernible clinical disease and serves as a potential source of infection to others. Three elements have to occur to form a carrier state. First, the presence in the body of a disease agent. Then, two, the absence of recognizable symptoms and signs of the disease. Three, shedding of the disease agent in discharge of or excretions. In the other hand, animal reservoirs for the zoonotic infection, we talked about that already. There are over 100 zoonotic diseases that can be covered to an animal from animal to a man. Reservoir in non-living things are soil and inanimate matter that can also act as a reservoir for infection. For example, soil may harbor agents that cause tetanus, anthrax, or coccidioidomycosis. The modes of transmission, we have direct transmission that could be possible through direct contact, droplet infection, contact with soil, incubation in inoculation into skin or mucosa, transplacental transmission, and indirect transmission, vehicle-borne, vector-borne, mechanical or biological, airborne, formite-borne, and unclean hands and fingers. A susceptible host, an infectious agent seeks a susceptible host aiming susceptible parasitants for a stage are required to successfully parasitism. First, we need a portal of entry, then a site of election inside the body, three, a portal of exit, and four, the survival in external environment. And now we're talking about virulence and case fatality rate. Virulence is the degree of pathogenicity. The disease evoking power of microorganisms in a given host, numerically expressed as the ratio of the number of cases over an infection to the total number infected as determined by immunoassay. When death is the only criterion of severity, this is the case of fatality rate. The case fatality rate for infection disease is the proportion of infected individuals who die from the infection of the infection. This is a function of the severity of the infection, and it is heavily influenced by how many new cases are not diagnosed. Serial interval are infection period. Serial interval is the gap in time between the onset of the primary and secondary cases. The interval between recipient of infection and maximal ineffective of the host. Infectious or communicable period is the length of time a person can transmit a disease. Incubation and latent period. Incubation period is the time from exposure to development of the disease. In other words, the time interval between invasion and infections by an infectious agent and the appearance of the first signs or symptoms for the disease in question. Latent period, the period between exposure and the onset of infection diseases. And that's all for today. I hope you have learned something with this class, and we see each other next time.